Hello, everyone. We are, okay, there we go. One person was left behind in the waiting room. Okay, we're gonna get started. I will continue to admit people as people join, but for the sake of time and respecting everyone's days, we will get ourselves going. So I am going to introduce our presenter here in a moment, but some just housekeeping reminders to please always have yourself on mute if you are not speaking. If you have a question for Jess and you don't want to forget it, feel free to throw it in the chat and we will get to it at the end. If you want to verbally ask your question, I ask that you just raise your hand. And again, we'll go through the order of hand raises at the end and Jess can address any of the questions that you guys have. So without further ado, our presenter today is Jess Yoder. She received her bachelor's in education from Purdue University and has worked as an elementary school teacher for 6 years in Indianapolis. She then received a master's in public health from IU with a focus on administration. She worked at the Indiana Department of Health as the Childhood Obesity Program Coordinator, receiving guidance from the CDC on other school health experts around the country to provide assistance to Indiana schools on a variety of school health topics. Jessica now works for the Indiana Department of Health Education as the Project Aware Specialist with funding from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. Jessica supports the agency's development of resources and professional development to increase mental health services, awareness, and prevention in schools, along with social and emotional learning. The project supports the implementation of 11 demonstration districts to solicit insight, data, and guidance for statewide implementation. She's also a trained facilitator for the Center for Mind-Body Medicine, and she lives here in Indianapolis with her husband, Max, and her daughter, Marnie. So I will send it over to Jessica.
Okay, sorry, Megan. I'm going to have to re-share my screen because I got a little toggled there.
You're okay.
All right. Oh, are you seeing my screen? I just need to do my presentation from the beginning, correct?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, feel free to chime in at any point because I can't see y'all's faces right now. Okay, so thank you for that introduction, Megan. I am here to talk about the intersection of farm to school and a more integrative approach. This title couldn't be more broad. So I was lucky enough to be able to kind of take this in the direction that I thought was relevant to our time today, but then also hopefully my past experiences as a teacher and then working for the Department of Health and kind of being ingrained in farm to school and learning from my former coworker, Naima, and now being at the department, hopefully those experiences can help give you a more holistic view. This presentation is not a how to implement farm to school. There are individuals beyond myself far better equipped to help you do that. Megan and Naima, that's their job. The purpose of this presentation is to make the case as to kind of why it is in school and community's best interest to develop a robust farm to school program. There is a wide range of benefits related to student well-being, success, and engagement that hopefully I can present some research. There are several hyperlinks in this presentation to which you won't be able to access in the moment, but hopefully Megan can follow up with the slides and you can access all of those hyperlinks. My hope is that after this presentation, you will have a better ability to kind of make the case for farm to school. If you have individuals that maybe need buy-in or maybe need to see the connection to broader school initiatives, perhaps you maybe need to connect farm to school programming to different outcomes beyond just those obvious outcomes. So we'll go over kind of the overarching question here in a moment. Megan already did a great job of introducing me, so I won't go into kind of my background, but I will tell you a little bit more about Project Aware and kind of what I do at the department. So Project Aware is a federal grant that was awarded to the Department of Education almost 4 years ago. And this grant is dedicated to comprehensive school-based mental health. So when I left the Department of Health, when I was kind of ingrained in nutrition and physical activity world, I was then shifted into more of kind of the mental health space. But I did my master's thesis on the whole school, whole community, whole child model. So I can't really unknow what I know about how it is in our best interest to be integrated. And I also say that to say we're really not even doing that very well now. When I dove into the comprehensive mental health space within schools, there's so much work that needs to be done within there that, you know, part of my job is to help schools do it in a more integrated way, but there still is a ton of improvement needed. So we only have one more year on the grant that I work on, and we are doing our best at the state level to advocate for more funding for this work, because unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, a lot of this work is happening due to federal grants and not necessarily state allocated funding. All right, so our agenda today is we're going to start here in a moment with a mindful moment to kind of get ourselves grounded and in the space. We are going to overview some of the frameworks that I will be referencing and will hopefully ground this conversation. And then we'll kind of dive into each of the farm to school pillars. So school gardens, education, local and nutritious food. What are some of the outcomes beyond, like I said, just those obvious outcomes that maybe could be utilized to make the case within schools and communities for farm to school? And then I will end with some advocacy tips for you and potentially any colleagues that you would like to share this information with. So we are going to take a moment to do some reflection. We're actually going to do something called guided imagery. So if you are driving and listening to this, I don't encourage you to close your eyes. But if you aren't driving and are in this space where you feel comfortable to close your eyes and kind of let go of maybe whatever text message you were writing or whatever email you were finishing, and just give yourself the gift right now to just kind of pause and really kind of do some imagination tapping into. So really quickly, just about guided imagery. Imagery includes words and thoughts that represent kind of all of our senses. So I'm going to be guiding you and giving you some questions that will tap into all of those 5 senses. So hearing, touch, smell, sight, taste. Imagery is connected to so many important functions of our brain, and there is research that supports that a consistent practice around guided imagery can have benefits on both your mental health and your physical health. So that's just a quick overview of guided imagery. So if you would like to, close your eyes. If you are not comfortable closing your eyes, maybe take yourself off of camera, lower your gaze, try to find yourself present here in this moment, in this virtual space that we're in. So I invite you just to focus on your breath, breathing slowly and imagining yourself in a favorite outdoor space or garden. Put a picture up of a garden on the slide, so if that is helpful. As you breathe, just try to imagine that space. It might be a space that you encountered as a young child. It might be your own backyard. It might be a local park that you like going to. Try to just imagine that space and just notice. How do you feel right now in the space? If you have thoughts beyond just this imagination space, go ahead and let those thoughts come and then just gently let them go. And focus on maybe some more specific things, like what smells do you notice? You might make note of what sounds you're hearing. Maybe what would you taste if you found something edible in this space. Again, just breathing in the air around you and noticing the sensations that you're feeling as you're imagining this favorite outdoor space or garden. As you take any last few noticings, maybe there was something hiding that you didn't smell, you remember that you might hear something or feel something, but just take another deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth, expressing gratitude for this outdoor space and the opportunities that it gives us. And when you're ready, I invite you to come back into this virtual space with me. And just notice how you feel. So that was guided imagery. Some of my colleagues and I, we participated in a training called Mind-Body Medicine, and that was one of the techniques that was used. We do a much longer version, but for this time we have today, I thought I'd just give a taste of this, but also it's relevant to the content today in that, you know, outdoor spaces, gardens within schools can provide a space for us to be present in the moment. Life is so fast and so furious sometimes that being outdoors and being in the present moment can in itself, beyond, you know, actual guided imagery or anything specific, is beneficial to our mental and physical health. And so we're going to talk about that more here in a moment. All right. Okay, so our overarching question for today is how can farm to school benefit students' mental health, well-being, and engagement in the school and community? And even as I'm reading that question there, I, you know, am making note that I was a former educator, come from a family of educators. I typically am always talking about students' mental health, students' well-being, students engaging, but I have to pause and remind myself that these strategies, these initiatives have just as much of a benefit on the adults in these spaces as well. So the kind of outcomes that I'm going to mention may seem specific to students, but this is also something that is beneficial to adults within schools as well. So like I said, I'm not going to go into the kind of what of the core elements of farm to school. I'm going to assume that most of you on this call are well aware of those pillars and what kind of goes into making those happen within schools. But we're going to dive into each one. Before we do that, I did want to ground us in a kind of overview of what we call the Indiana Social Emotional Learning Competencies. So there are 7 here, and these were released in, let's see, 2019, early 2019. And they are competencies, and so they're different from standards that are typically taught within schools. So you might think of math, science, social studies. Those are all standards. They have to be taught, and they're typically going to be found somewhere on an assessment. Indiana Social Emotional Learning Competencies are not required. There are 3 of them that are kind of intertwined with our employability skills in Indiana, and those are required by statute. But these really were just guidance based on evidence that has been around for decades now as to why it is in schools' best interest to be proactive about student social and emotional well-being. So in a similar way that we teach math, it is in schools' best interest to teach these social and emotional competencies. Yes, there is a time and space to do more kind of downstream or crisis response or actual mental health therapy within schools. That's not what these are. These are guidance for any educator. They do not have to be a mental health therapist or even specialize in it at all. As for a second grade teacher, such as myself, back in the day, to kind of emphasize and teach these skills throughout the year in the same way that I would teach reading, math, and language arts. So you will, at the end of this presentation, have kind of instructions on how to access kind of a lot more information about these competencies. I'm really going to quickly go through each of them so you can get an idea, because some of these are going to come up when we're talking about some of the outcomes of farm to school. So when we talk about sensory motor integration, we're talking about body awareness and kind of recognizing sensations in the body. So the guided imagery that we just did is an example of a strategy that could be used to build student sensory motor integration. So being able to kind of calm the mind, calm the body, be present in the moment, use the breath, all of those things are beneficial and important for managing transitions for students, changing routines, and also increasing alertness. Insight is the ability to know your emotions and how they affect your thoughts and your actions. So gaining insight will hopefully help build kind of self-confidence, self-esteem, and then that empathy piece is really big here. So we might talk a little bit here about kind of building a connection and community, but we can't build connection and community unless we are kind of interacting with a diverse set of people within our community and kind of understanding their traditions that occur within those communities. Regulation is kind of an obvious one. It's the ability to recognize and manage my emotions. Obviously, we want students to be able to regulate themselves, but it should not be a given that they know how to do that. They might actually know the opposite of how to escalate situations, and that's kind of what they've been taught and what's been modeled. So how do we help students use strategies to regulate themselves during times of stress, because that stress is going to happen? Collaboration, easy one, the ability to work well with others. As I'm going through these competencies, I hope in your mind you're thinking about kind of maybe the work that you hope to do or the work that you're already doing around farm to school, and how there is an obvious connection between these social emotional learning competencies. Mindset is the ability to demonstrate cognitive flexibility and a willingness to learn. It is critical for building perseverance, adaptability. As I'm even saying these, I'm thinking about, some of the farm to school programming that I have seen, resilience, and the ability to give and receive constructive feedback. And then critical thinking is kind of one that we see probably most within schools, because critical thinking is kind of built into many of our academic standards. But it's really just the ability to make constructive choices and kind of understand how we learn. And then the last one is connection, and that is the ability to have strong social awareness and give students the ability to take the perspective of others and empathize with people of diverse backgrounds and cultures. So these 7 competencies are what kind of guide some of the prevention work that we're doing around mental health. We are, especially through Project Aware, we are doing a lot of work when it comes to kind of tier 3 mental illness or therapy for students who have been potentially diagnosed or not, and need that kind of one-on-one or group settings. The work that the competencies that I'm putting up here, the assumption is that every single student should have access to spaces where they can learn about, practice, and potentially be assessed on, their regulation skills, because these are competencies that will help them in the future and will help them kind of be happy and present in the moment. And we'll talk about kind of the connection to academic success. All right, so schools and public health. So I kind of started my professional career within schools. I thought I was going to be a teacher the rest of my life, and then I got really interested in public health, and I started kind of diving into wormholes about public health, and I couldn't stop. And so now my kind of I guess expertise and passions lie at that intersection. And as I was digging into some of the research around mental health and farm to school, this UK study, which is actually pretty recent, 2021, stood out to me because this is we're really zooming out here about public health strategies. So there are a ton of public health strategies that many of you are actively involved in. But this study said that public health strategies to optimize the mental well-being of children should include the promotion of good nutrition. So we can have all the mental health supports that we want within schools or even communities. But until we address the basic needs, such as, making sure that we have nutrient-dense foods in our schools, our effort to improve overall public health will fall short. So in other words, we can't do one with the other. And unfortunately, within the work that I even do on a daily basis, I am laser focused on mental health. And so even just putting this presentation together really helped me bust down my silo for a moment and think, okay, wait a second. How can we talk more about nutrition within the work? And I hope that within your work, if you are really intertwined in farm to school and nutrition, you can say, okay, how can I break down that silo and talk a little bit about the connection to mental health? I just remembered, Megan, that I told you I was going to pause between slides if you had any questions, and I have not been pausing. So any questions so far?
I think you're good so far.
Cool, thank you. Okay, so a little bit more about that mind-body connection, because when I say that and when I talk about breaking down silos, it really is a paradigm shift. A paradigm shift that is potentially something that is a generational shift that will hopefully happen, but it's going to take a lot of time. And so this slide is actually from some of the work that we do at the Center for Mind-Body Medicine, and it is the basis for everything. So I'll explain that here in a second. So on the left side, you see that our thoughts, our feelings, our emotional experiences, and beliefs and attitudes. So when I see all of those words, I think about, okay, those are the things up in my head. This is what's happening in my mental health. Those things can profoundly shape our biological functioning. Okay, so then as I think about those words, I think, okay, that's what's how is my body functioning? Am I feeling good? Am I sick? Am I not sick? How am I actually feeling in my body? So if we are applying this paradigm shift to today's topic, so our mental health has an impact on our body, not just the food we eat or how much movement we get. Stress hormones are extremely powerful. For example, I'll give a personal example, and Naima and Megan may laugh because I was talking about this right before we started. I took my 2-year-old daughter to summer camp on Monday, very first time. First time she's ever been with adults that she wasn't familiar with. And of course, 2 hours passed, she got home, immediately, raging fever, right? So you think, oh my goodness, you're just now getting into the childcare sickness. Yes, I am. But she's a pandemic baby. So she gets a fever immediately. Sure, she could have contracted a virus roaming around summer camp, right? There could have been germs and she put her hands in her mouth, right? That could have happened and very well probably did. But if we are to take into account the high levels of stress that she was under, having, her mom drop her off with strangers, thinking about the effects of those hormones on her immune system. So I shouldn't be really surprised that she got sick, right? When her stress hormones are high, her immune system is not able to function in optimal levels, right? So those boundaries are down and she is more apt to get sick. So I think that experience there, I was thinking, oh my goodness, this is a great example of how when we are in high moments of stress, and even just think about your life, when you are super stressed, how many times have you found yourself at the end of that stressful experience or during it, you get sick? You get a fever, you get a cold, you're like, I can't sleep, I'm not sure what's going on with my body, everything just feels bad. Well, there is an explanation for that. And sometimes that can be connected to stress and the hormones that are released when we are stressed, especially when we're under moments of chronic stress, but that's beyond our topic today. So inversely, what happens in our bodies and how we care for them can affect how we feel and what we believe. So what's happening in our body can affect our mental health. So kind of think of these two things inversely. The food that we eat has an effect on how we feel and think. So how many of you have ever eaten a piece of pizza midday and you feel like you need a nap, or you had like brain fog? You're like, well, I just don't feel like, I don't feel right. Or you got in an argument with somebody, you're like, what's going on? You probably didn't make a connection to that piece of pizza that you ate because it was delicious and you have no regrets. But compared to eating a hearty salad, I would just encourage you to start noticing those shifts and kind of the food that you're eating and how you're feeling and how it's affecting you. Beyond just today's topic, there really is a shift happening in our healthcare system. I think it's a great one. I think it will be really slow, and that's unfortunate, but hopefully some of this mind-body research is kind of shifting our at least our practitioners' thoughts about how we stay healthy and how we address illness. Mental health and chronic disease prevention cannot be treated or prevented in silos. We know that now. So kind of the work that we're doing within hospitals in terms of the work that they're doing is also important to learn from kind of the prevention methods. And prevention, same thing. We need to learn from each other in figuring out how to prevent mental illness and how to think outside of the box. Okay, so I'm going to jump into each of the pillars of Farm to School and talk about some of the benefits beyond just the obvious. And the first one, I came upon a study that was laser focused on school gardens, and the title of it said, School Gardens, a Social and Emotional Place. And I had never really thought of it that way. So the data that was recorded was actually 223 sheets at school gardening. So students were kind of reporting how they were feeling when they were interacting in their school garden, around their school garden. And the results showed that 5 of the 10 emotions that were perceived significant more often were happiness, pride, surprise, and wonder, more often in the school garden than feelings such as disgust, fear and anger, sadness, embarrassment, contempt. So if we're thinking about kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that would tell us that these top emotions, and I before I go into this point, I want to say, you know, the feeling of frustration is not a bad one. I actually literally said to my daughter this morning, I see you're frustrated. It's totally okay to be frustrated. I get frustrated sometimes too. We're not saying that the emotions on the right side are bad. We're looking at the context of school. Okay, so if we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the top emotions allow individuals to better access higher order thinking skills. In fact, wonder actually is a higher order thinking skill itself. So wouldn't it be amazing to have a school full of kids full of wonder all the time, right? There would be a ton of learning going on in that space. Inversely, when students are feeling fearful or anxious or even embarrassed, their basic needs are not being met. They are not feeling loved. They are not feeling safe. They are not feeling like they belonged. And they are less likely to be engaged in learning because their basic needs have not been met. So I think that kind of if you put Maslow's hierarchy needs on top of this, the takeaway would be that school gardens are a great thing to have in schools because it encourages students to access some of those higher order thinking skills. There's a center actually that is funded by the U.S. Department of Education called the National Center on Safe and Supportive Learning Environments. We use a lot of their resources with Project Aware because this center really, though it is funded by U.S. Department of Education, thinks outside of the box when it comes to academic success. It's thinking, how do we create safe, supportive, engaged school environments? And typically it's the answer to that question is not, we need to have better school curriculum or we need to, adjust our assessment. It's typically like we need to implement social emotional learning. One of the things that they found within their research is that school gardens can provide students with the tools they need to manage their emotions and improve their learning potential. And here are some of the short-term outcomes that they found. And this last bullet point here is actually from a separate research article. They found that school gardens, I've already talked kind of about stress hormones, but one of those stress hormones is called cortisol. So being in a school garden can reduce levels of cortisol, which is released during stressful situations, which make gardening an effective tool for managing anger, anxiety, and other negative emotions. And individuals of all ages who garden report feeling relaxed and calm when gardening. And that gardens provide an experiential, hands-on learning environment where students can engage, explore, and reason independently. I think about the Montessori kind of way in terms of like 0 to 5. And man, if I just had a wish, it's that we just extended that through all of schooling, because their kind of thought is that when we help kids engage, explore, kind of do things on their own, they are much more likely to be motivated, one, but then also to find kind of solutions that they have created, and those tend to be the best. And the last kind of short-term outcome that I found within the research was that community gardens, so this one's specific to community gardens, they serve as a center for social activity and civic engagement. So there are some schools that I have worked with who have kind of made sure that the school gardens that they are providing for their students during the school day is also accessible for community members to help cultivate, to manage at the end of the season. And those tend to be wonderful because it's bridging the gap between schools and communities, which is always great. But then it's also giving the access to that garden beyond just the students who go to that school. Some of the long-term outcomes that they found was that school gardens build emotional connections to the food that are essential to behavior change. So when children spend weeks or even months growing their food, they feel proud of and connected to it. And I couldn't agree more personally, because I am in my mid-30s and I do not like tomatoes. Like whole tomatoes, for some reason, just have freaked me out until I grew them myself, until I decided, hey, I'm just going to grow tomatoes this summer and see if it takes. And then guess what? I had a lot of tomatoes and I had nothing to do with them other than to eat them. So I did. And now, guess what? I'm cool with tomatoes. Okay, so that kind of experience helped me invest in kind of going outside of my box. Students eat up to 3 times more fruits and vegetables at school lunch, regardless of whether or not that food was grown in the garden, when they are interacting with gardens during the school year. And this last one is kind of points to this academic piece. So when students are able to build their emotional and social capacities, these skills enable students to increase their academic performance by improving their participation in the classroom. So this might feel like a secondary, is this directly connected? Well, yes, right? It's not causal. It's definitely something that could be correlated. But I mentioned that I come from a family of educators. I was an educator. I now have worked for the Department of Education for 4 years now, and I still cringe when someone asks me how my work, so when I say my work, it's typically around school-based mental health. How does your work have an impact on academic achievement? Personally, I think helping the students learn how to be mentally healthy is a valid and really important outcome in itself that I think should be important to schools, and similarly to farm to school work. So helping students learn about and access healthy food should be a valid enough outcome for schools to strive for. So when I think about that, my first reaction is to get frustrated. So I let myself get frustrated for a moment over and over and over. But when I step back and I look at the education system as a whole and the history of our educational system, schools still are not incentivized by these metrics. So by mental health metrics, by improving access and consumption of healthy food. They're not. Whether we want them to or not, that's not at the end of the day what they're held accountable for. The tide is shifting, so it's not all doom. It is shifting to a more holistic accountability structure, but it's like, pushing a rock up a mountain. Traditionally, schools were being judged by test scores and graduation rates. So this last point is important. Because that secondary connection to, it's not always just about the academic piece. It can be about some of these outside activities that are happening outside the classroom and outside traditional kind of models of schooling. Okay, I'm going to move away from school gardens and jump to another pillar, but I'll pause and see if there's any questions or comments. I'm open to comments as well.
We did have one question in the chat asking if there was similar research that shows that, like, the similar trends too that you presented about, like, feelings and outcomes in garden spaces with children for adults and or senior populations.
Oh, that's a good question. I'm sure there is. In my research, I was pretty laser focused on children. But some of the research, I very much encourage you to click the hyperlinks for the sources that you see on these slides, because some of them were much more broad in terms of they weren't looking at a very specific population; they were looking at communities. So some of that could be connected. So I very much encourage you to look at those sources. I did not see any that I recall off of memory. But Megan, before I move to the next, I keep talking about the hyperlinks. They will have access to these slides afterwards, correct?
Yes, okay. We will upload the recording of this presentation and the slides that Jess provides to our website on the webinars recording page.
Cool, great question though. If you find any, please share it with me. Okay, so we're going to move on to nutrition and agriculture education, which is the second pillar of Farm to School. And I want to start by talking about some limitations and some opportunities. Just kind of grounding us in the reality of kind of nutrition education, which when I think about nutrition education, I typically first think about health education, because that is kind of the most obvious place that all students in our state are learning about food. Yes, you have some schools and some school districts who have highly invested in making sure that nutrition education is kind of outside of just your traditional health education spaces. But as a whole, students are required, 1 credit of health education is required for high school graduation. That is written in statute. So these standards include kind of knowledge of core health concepts, content, and underlying principles of health promotion and disease prevention. And that's kind of standard 1. So all of that is standard 1. And then standards 2 and 8 actually identify key processes and skills that are applicable to healthy living. So it's not like standard 2 is specific to nutrition, and then standard 3 is specific to physical activity. And it's more about kind of the skills, which is great because research shows that if we give students the opportunity to learn about the skills needed, they can apply it in many different domains. But 1 credit, that is what is required in Indiana. In some of the research that I was digging into, I found a couple different stats, both of which are not great. Most children, Harvard found a study that most children receive only 3.4 hours of nutrition education a year. I am not sure which population they were looking at. And then the CDC stated that U.S. students receive less than 8 hours of required nutrition education each school year. So just process that for a minute. 8 hours. That's like 1 day. That's like a work day. That's like me sitting in 1 work day in an 8-hour meeting, which is, you don't want me in an 8-hour meeting, learning about all I need to know about food. I'm still learning about food, still. So kind of the point of that is that our systems don't give students a ton of opportunity to interact with education around food and how our food is grown and how it is accessed. A couple of opportunities is that in 2018, we have what are called career and technical education standards. So CTE standards were introduced. There are now some for agriculture specific, which are pretty robust. But this is, again, kind of a subset and a CTE kind of path that a student would have to choose to go on because they have already, decided I am interested in agriculture and farming and learning how to grow food. We also have a pretty robust 4-H infrastructure in Indiana. These 2 bullet points, though, these are just some of our students are going to be able to learn about that. It's definitely not something that all students are learning about. And I also want to point to, a reality is that children learn about food long before they enter the K-12 school system. And these factors can support and or contradict school-based nutrition education. So even within that nutrition education, there's this whole other space of learning that is happening from the time that children are born. So some of the factors that influence children's eating behaviors are family systems, such as parental eating habits, and early life experiences, such as kind of feeding strategies, how kids grew up eating. And this kind of pyramid here summarizes kind of all of those factors and kind of how they're weighted. So obviously at the bottom, genetic predisposition is there. You'll see school lunches there in kind of the second to lowest tier, and nutritional knowledge, they're in the lowest tier. But there's so many more factors at play when it comes to how children learn about food. I don't bring this up to make you kind of hopeless or help make you lose hope. Like, even if we do the best nutrition education and the best farm to schooling, it's not going to matter. That's not what I'm saying. I want to emphasize that this needs to be a community-wide approach to this work. It is worth thinking outside the box on finding solutions to problems in front of and working together and breaking down some of those silos. So just food for thought here, and just kind of grounding us in the reality is when we're talking about nutrition education, yes, we need to make sure that our schools are doing their best to provide nutrition education, but there are also other ways within the community that students' nutritional knowledge can be affected. But I will say that I was digging into kind of some of the resources from CDC, and as they're talking about nutrition education and some of the benefits and some of the outcomes, they primarily point to direct outcomes related to eating behaviors. So, nutrition education helps students eat a variety of foods within each food group. Great. It's going to help them limit foods and beverages high in added sugar and sodium and solid fat. It's going to help them choose whole grain products. It's going to help them follow an eating pattern that supports healthy growth and development. In my experience, those were really intertwined in farm to school. They're using these benefits a lot, and that's great. Continue to do that. But I want to challenge you to think to yourself what other outcomes can be indirectly linked so that educators and stakeholders are more inclined to invest in a comprehensive health education that includes nutrition education and other farm to school kind of opportunities and strategies. One of those, so some of the research that I found was around kind of how nutrition education increases self-awareness and social awareness. So if we are providing more nutrition education within our schools, that will create spaces for students to think about how they think and feel depending on the food that they eat, okay? Similar to what I talked about eating pizza at lunch, being encouraged to kind of just make that connection between how am I feeling, how am I behaving, how am I acting based on the food that I ate, building kind of that space to be self-aware about food. And then social awareness, building that connection. Students can learn about food and different cultures and relationships with food, along with traditions around food within nutrition education, and they can increase their understanding and empathy for different cultures and appreciation for diversity. Of course, you would have to think about kind of the quality of that nutrition education and making sure that it provides students with opportunities to learn about different cultures and the food that they eat. But it's an opportunity. And then kind of my gift to you is that the CDC actually does have I think it's a 2-page infographic about how nutrition education can support students' mental health. Some of the things that they reference within their research is that nutrition education teaches students how to be aware of how it feels to be full and how it feels to be hungry. So going back to that self-awareness piece. And then school meals are an opportunity to practice kind of accepting and turning down food. So kind of like be at boundary creating, which I think is wonderful. So that infographic does a great job of summarizing it. I just pulled out a couple here on this slide. Okay, Benefits of local food procurement. We're coming up here on the last quarter of the hour, so I will quickly go through this last pillar. I do believe, as I was doing some research, I was thinking, oh my goodness, I'm pretty sure that the Division of Nutrition and Physical Activity has already done a ton of digging into this. So I'm going to start there. So as I started that digging, I, of course, found some of their toolkits. And within one of their toolkits on procurement, they said incorporating more local, nutrient-dense foods into cafeterias can enhance or even kickstart other farm-to-school programming efforts. So I put that there just because I think that I know that this sometimes is the hardest piece of farm-to-school, but one that potentially can have more bang for your buck. So if you are increasing opportunities for students to interact with and eat local food, you're going to have some of the dividends in terms of the nutrition education and the other pillars that we've already talked about. So some other benefits of local food procurement potentially connected to mental health or some of those social emotional learning competencies that we talked about at the beginning. Community engagement. So an example of this would be, developing a relationship. So schools or even a whole district developing a relationship with a local farmer that sells their produce to the school. And that would enable students to understand how they might grow and sell food locally as a post-secondary option. So connecting it to, yes, we want to do this local food procurement, but in addition, we want to incentivize or encourage that producer to connect with students who are eating that food and show them kind of a post-secondary option or a pathway, which is some of the language that is really being pushed, at the State House and here at the Department of Education. Post-secondary pathways. How can we connect some of the local food procurement strategies that we're doing within schools to some of these post-secondary work that we're doing? Social connectedness I love this example. So maybe highlighting a local farmer within the cafeteria. So you do all of the work within the cafeteria to do that local food procurement. You jump through all of the hoops. How can we then advertise that this farmer actually has a stand at the weekend farmers markets, and that families can visit and purchase local nutrient-dense food similar to what they are consuming within the cafeteria. Just an idea and a connection. And then this last one is kind of the most obvious one, I guess. But this one is, I think, important in terms of making sure that we are connecting the kind of what are we eating and what is the impact on our poor mental health. So both of these are hyperlinks to some studies. And one study found that children and adolescents with worse mental health reported significantly poorer dietary patterns. So some of you might be thinking, well, yeah, if you're not feeling well, you're probably not going to be eating very well. I can say that on like a weekly basis for myself even. So that might seem obvious, but for those that are working on improving mental health outcomes in schools, so your school psychologists, your counselors, your social workers, I would encourage you to connect with them and say, are we thinking about food and kind of what are the eating patterns and how we can improve those and see how that might have an impact on their mental health outcomes. And then the second study that is hyperlinked there found that the consumption of fast food, sugar, and soft drinks was associated with a higher prevalence of diagnosed ADD or ADHD. Again, that is certainly not causal, but a correlation and kind of one of the factors that can be considered when it comes to decreasing some of the prevalence of mental illness within our children. And then I love this quote because I love talking about like happy hormones and kind of the hormones associated with positive mental health and then, inversely negative mental health. But 90% of serotonin, which is kind of the happy hormone that we have piping through our body on a daily basis, are produced in our guts. So if you want to have a happy, healthy gut, it comes from a happy, balanced diet. All right, last few slides here, and then I'd be happy to take any questions or comments that you have. What do we do now? how do I take this information and do better when it comes to advocating within your school or your community? I'm sure you're doing many things that are working in terms of kind of meeting school administrators, meeting superintendents, meeting even teachers where they are and kind of with the capacity that they currently have within schools, which has been so difficult over the past couple of years, especially. You know, I've learned that even when you are providing schools a ton of money to do some of this work, it's still really hard because that's the bottom line. Being in schools, being really in any domain within our communities is just more difficult right now. So hopefully we can start to improve some of that. But when you have decided to kind of take the steps and do a little bit more advocating and maybe getting that school to dive in, what can you do to use some of the information presented today to improve those advocacy efforts? So one thing you could do is familiarize yourself with those competencies. These social emotional learning competencies used to be posted to the public on the Department of Education's website. They are no longer. You have to actually go to our learning management kind of platform called Moodle. So if you go to this website here, you have to either log in or use an existing account. You can just use whatever email address. You don't have to be an educator to access it. And then you would search for the course Student, School, and Family Engagement, which is the team that I now serve on within the department. And you would enroll and use the enrollment key engagement. And you would be able to access all of the competencies, K-12, and some of the toolkits and strategies. And so within that, you know, if you're learning, reading about social emotional learning and how it may or may not be implemented within the schools that you work in, which I'm sure it is in one form, they might be calling it something different. How can you use the work that you're doing around Farm to School to connect with that and say, hey, I see that you're doing a lot of work around regulation. And this might also just be a local conversation that you need to have around social emotional learning. Here are ways in which students are able to, you know, practice regulation or practice self-awareness within nutrition education. How can we kind of do these two things in tandem together? You can also visit this website here, DOE/Project Aware. We did a survey about 2 years ago where we tried to find the main point of contact within school districts, all school districts around the state, for mental wellness within their schools. You can connect with that person if their data is available. It was an optional survey, so not everyone filled it out. You can also view some of the school district's wellness practices and curriculum being used. So if you can't get in touch with that person, hopefully they have some data represented here. And we did just do a new survey that will be updating that website here in the next few months. So if you don't see the school district that you locally impact, then hopefully that will be up there here in the next few months. If not, you can just send me an email and I'll let you know if I have any contacts within that district or if any of my teammates have contacts within that district. Like I said, I did my master's thesis on the whole school, whole community, whole child model, and I would be remiss to not bring it up. But I think that it's, you know, beyond just kind of mental health, which is the world that I live in, school-based mental health. I think it's important to build infrastructure that aligns policy, process, and practice for Farm to School, and not just, you know, your social and emotional climate or your counseling psychology services. So those are kind of the two pillars that we focused on today, but also health education. How can you connect with that health educator? How can you connect with employee wellness? So your EAP programming. Could some of your Farm to School work connect there? And then family engagement we didn't even talk about, which is really just so important. How can we engage families within this work as well? And this is something kind of pie in the sky, but an accomplishment that one of our Project Aware districts has most recently achieved, and they adopted a district strategic goal. So these strategic goals are written up in their school improvement plans. They have very specific strategies to accomplish these. And when I found out that one of our corporations had adopted this, I was so happy because like right above, you know, we want our students to achieve academically and have post-secondary success. We also, in cooperation with our community, want to support student well-being, mental wellness, and the whole child. So we want our students to feel healthy, safe, engaged, supported, and challenged. And that comes directly from the WISC model here that you see. So that is something that obviously, the farm to school work would fit directly with, but that would need to be kind of a top-down decision that's made with stakeholders within the school districts. And then hopefully you have heard about the Indiana Grown for Schools recognition program. I think this is a great step in terms of advocacy, is kind of investing some time to be recognized for your efforts, because the more that schools are seeing that schools are investing in this, it's kind of, we like to do the thing that our classmate is doing and is being recognized for. So I encourage you to either apply for this recognition program or encourage those within the schools that you are connected with to do so. And then the last thing, these are all hyperlinks. Some of these might be of interest to you, specific to early care and education. There was a ton of research around promoting healthy relationships with food. We didn't even go down that path, but I think it's an important conversation to have as well. And that could be a connection kind of with your health services and your school nurse. And then one of them is kind of how public health strategies, kind of that conversation around the broader public health around mental wellness should include promotion of good nutrition. That hyperlink is there. So I will stop. There is my contact information. If anything, we only have a few minutes. If anything was of interest to you, if you have more questions about, if you want to be connected with someone within the comprehensive school mental health world, I'd be happy to do that for you. But that is all I have for you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I have a quick something. Thank you, Jess, for that wonderful presentation. I have more of just kind of a prompt that I think will be a nice way to leave things. And, as I was listening to you talk and thinking about the ways in which your work around mental health in schools and our work around nutrition security in schools, I think there may be some similarities about some of the things that you've experienced over the last couple of years. And particularly what I'm thinking about is, I think that during the pandemic, one of the most sort of scary and sobering things for folks working in nutrition security was really the ways that it laid bare how reliant we are as a society on schools to not even necessarily going down that road of nutrition education, but just to keep our kids fed, right? So when that space was removed for so long, it was so scary, not only for us working in, but for families, for kids themselves. And I think that one thing that we're really struggling with as a field right now is sort of figuring out how to walk and chew gum at the same time, right? Like, how do we triage these immediate needs related to food security while also working on these larger systems level paradigm shifts that you're talking about? And I really imagine that you also dealt with some of that related to the mental health crises that kids were facing throughout the pandemic. So I just wonder if you have any wisdom to share related to that, or any strategies that you came upon during the pandemic that you would want to share.
Yeah, great question. And my first thought is that I think that the only thing that school mental health had going for them was the technology piece. You can't feed people over the internet, but you can talk to them. And you can help them feel connected, and you can help them feel safe. So I think that's potentially the only difference. But I think one that when you're talking about kind of doing these two things all at once, definitely 100%, because there's, in addition to kind of the struggles that we had during the pandemic, there's also an unbelievable lack of workforce, qualified people to actually diagnose, or even just simply, use evidence-based strategies to help people deal with hard things. So I don't necessarily have an answer. I do have, just kind of like an encouragement for everyone, just to know that, in history of progress in all domains, doing both of these things is possible. So we're fighting the good fight. So I appreciate that. And I do think that I would love to just bring our two teams together and talk about that conversation, because I think there's a ton of similarities. I see Jonathan has his hand up. Jonathan, you going to take us past 4?
Oh, I probably will, but you don't have to answer this. But I wanted to, if you have any info and can forward it to us, that'd be great. You talked about how to get schools and districts to, buy into some of these nutrition improvement strategies and nutrition education, farm to school, the whole gamut of strategies that we would want to look at to improve nutrition and nutrition education. Is anybody looking at kind of chronic absenteeism as a a potential valued indicator by school administrators that may be linked to? I think I'd be harder pressed to say it's linked to nutrition education specifically, but
Sure.
It's probably clear it can be linked to nutrition status, food insecurity. And so if you think about, that all of these strategies, including nutrition education, farm to school, can be part of a comprehensive response to trying to strengthen the school environment in order to strengthen students' nutrition status.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, does that manifest, and are there linkages between nutrition status and chronic absenteeism? And because I think that's an indicator that has been elevated pretty highly here in Indiana, and it's in the state ESSA plan, or at least it was the last time I checked. And so I think a lot of schools are looking at it. And I think school nurses will often say, kids come in and they get sent home with gastric problems that are potentially linked to either a bad diet or didn't eat today, or et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. I think that's going back to kind of like, what is the bottom line right now for schools? Like, not what do we want the bottom line to be? What is it? Yes, chronic absenteeism is definitely in that bucket of, the traditional model, to be honest. It was like test scores, graduation rates, absenteeism. Are you getting the kids in school? Are they graduating? What's their test score? Like I said, it's evolving to be a much more holistic, thank goodness. I have not seen, in terms of the work around chronic absenteeism, especially potentially there was some work around a more kind of less punitive model to chronic absenteeism. It was shifting to that. There was a hard right turn when it came to chronic absenteeism during the pandemic, because then it was like, how do we even just like count where kids are? So the problem just became so much bigger in terms of like narrowing into like, why are kids absent? It's like, where are kids? And it's shifting. We're getting back to that space where we can actually like think about like, okay, we know kids are in school, and if they're not, why? But our team doesn't. We used to kind of have chronic absenteeism under our umbrella. That's now over in like school safety. So school nursing, health services, school safety, and chronic absenteeism is in a separate kind of domain right now. So I'm happy to connect you with that person and ask that question if that would be helpful.
Yeah, no, I just am wondering about. It's clear that making more. Maybe I have to do some more research to help build the case before we make that connection. But it just seemed like an opportunity, maybe something that we can try to do some research on.
For sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Good to see you.
Okay, everyone. Jess just dropped her email into the chat, and I will make sure that Jess's contact information is on our website alongside the recording, the slides that she provided, and information about her. So you will be able to find everything we presented here today in different formats on our webinar recordings page. I'm hoping by the end of the week, but if not, it will definitely be up there next week. I thank you all very much for joining us today. I know we're past 4 and losing people, so thank you all so much for being with us, and we hope to see you next month, where we have 2 pretty exciting webinars about nutrition.